are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Learning Lunch hosted by Format Approved. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Today's session is entitled Preventing Security Risk Analysis Failure and Protecting Your Practice. We're joined today by Charles Kilmer of Netgain, and here is his bio. Thank you so much for joining us today, Charles.
Absolutely, glad to help.
So Charles is an expert in this subject, and we've had him on Learning Lunches before. He's always given us great information, and so I'm really looking forward to this session. We'd also like to thank Netgain for sponsoring this Learning Lunch, making it available to the public at no charge. There's going to be great information in here, practical information for how you can protect yourself from really a rapidly changing threat environment out there in the cyber world. I'll let you look over the questions while I just take care of a brief housekeeping note, which is that if you're looking for the slides or the recording from this session, don't worry about that. After the session is over, we'll send an email out to all participants, whether they were able to attend live or not, that will include the slides as well as a video recording. And if you would like to ask questions of our expert today, please don't hesitate to do so. Type those questions into your chat area in the GoToWebinar controls, and we will usually save those questions until the end and then get to as many as time allows. If we run out of time, we'll ask our expert to provide written answers, but we usually can get to all of them. Okay, so that takes care of our housekeeping. Let's get to our subject today. So the first question we would like you to address today, Charles, is what are some of the cybersecurity threats facing organizations today?
Sure. So primarily in my mind, this comes down to phishing, those fraudulent emails that try to get us to help the hackers. By and large, our systems are very secure. Firewalls, solid programming practices protect our systems. Those poor hackers now need our help to compromise our information. So they send us emails, they give us phone calls, they drop USB keys, whatever they can do to get us to do what they want us to do. I love the phrase that the best way to get someone to do what you want them to do is get them to want to do it. So in this term, the modern hacker is the modern day con artist. They spend all their time figuring out how to manipulate people, how to get people to do what the hacker wants them to do. So that's getting them to transfer some money over a wire transfer, send a convincing email looking like it's from the CEO, targeted to the one person in the organization that is allowed to make wire transfers, is very effective. Sending malware or ransomware through email, or a link to ransomware or malware through email, convincing these people to open the documents, to click on those links. These are all primarily sent through email because email is largely free for them to send. They can send 100 or they can send 1,000,000 for about the same cost. And it's a numbers game. The more they play, the more they get.
Now, you mentioned ransomware, which is such a hot topic right now. Just to be sure that our audience understands how it works, could you give us a brief description?
Sure. Absolutely. So ransomware is not any different than any other malware in its how it gets into systems. They all come in through email or through some vulnerable piece of software you're running. The difference is in what they do afterwards. So there's data stealing malware, what we've had to deal with for the first up until 2013-ish, I guess. Ransomware, instead of stealing our information, encrypts it so we can't access it. And then they happily sell us the keys to access the data. They love that business model because it's a direct revenue model. Their return on investment is greatly improved because now they don't have to find the data that's valuable and work to export it and work to find a buyer and make sure that buyer isn't FBI and arrange some anonymous payment method. Now they just encrypt the data and provide an anonymous payment method for you to pay, largely through bitcoins. So ransomware gets into the system just the same way data stealing malware does. It just encrypts the data once it gets here.
Great description. All right, go on, please.
So 4 types of fraudulent emails or phishing attacks that try to get you to do something that they want you to do. fake accounts where it's pretty obvious. They'll include a quoted name. So it might be, quote, Charles Kilmer, quote, and then the email address may or may not be hidden because of how the email client handles that. So it might be harder to notice what the email address is, and therefore harder to notice that it's not the right email address. I've seen them come through where it's the person's real name, but then it's a very odd email address, obviously not that person's email address. They can also spoof the from address, so it appears to come from the real address, and then they include another email header, another email command called a reply to header. And that instructs your email client to send replies to that email to a different email address. If you don't notice that the email address changed when you hit reply, you may not notice that you're talking to a hacker. Their response then would spoof that from again and continue that charade. They can send them from a similar email address, either a similar domain name or a similar account if they happen to have access in that domain. I've seen examples where the domain name has 2 letters transposed. So it's really hard to notice that unless you're really looking at the domain name of that email address. And fourth, it can be the actual email account. If the password was compromised in some other password database breach and they used the same password, now a hacker can just log into your account through something like OWA, Outlook Web Access, or your Gmail account, and access the real email and send real emails maliciously. That's largely the 4 types of malicious emails we'll see come through. And largely they can be addressed by training, getting people to not automatically reply, spend a little bit of time looking at where the email address says it comes from, where your reply is going to, and inspecting that email address to make sure it is actually correct. The 4th one is harder to deal with because it's the actual sender's email address. That one, the only advice I can really say is be suspicious about it, and if they're asking you to do something that could compromise or damage something about the company, like send all W-2s, give that person an actual phone call and confirm verbally. You can deal a little bit with it by using strong passwords, strong unique passwords, so that some other website's password database breach doesn't compromise your organization, and then also implementing multi-factor authentication so that a simple password being guessed or discovered doesn't provide that access.
So that would be like, I know my bank does this, for example. If I log in on an unfamiliar device, it sends me a text that I have to then enter before I can get in. It's something like that, right?
Absolutely, and they can be text. There's the Google Authenticator, there's Authy. There are a bunch of those authenticator type apps for phones. I know Google is also providing that through their Google app on your phone. I know Twitter handles it a little differently. Different services will implement multi-factor. The point is, have some out-of-band method to provide another sort of temporary password.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of this last bullet here is sort of a way of doing the same thing, not as technical, but if the CEO sends you an email and says, "Hey, send all of our money to Belarusia," calling him is a way of confirming that that message is actually really from him.
Absolutely, it's a second factor. Yep.
All right, well, good advice. So why are healthcare organizations at increased risk of attack these days?
So I love this question. I get asked it. In my opinion, everyone is at risk. Like I said, they send these emails looking for anyone that will bite. So largely, ransomware tends to be opportunistic. They're just compromising anyone that happens to get compromised. We hear a lot about it, I think, because HIPAA is requiring disclosures. I think everybody's getting about the same number of these attacks. Targeted attacks tend to go for people that have money. So any organization that has a lot of W-2s or wire transfer funds available is at risk, and that isn't healthcare only, obviously. The ones that concern me are the ones that think that they don't need to do as much because they aren't a huge financial or a huge healthcare organization. and everybody is at risk. And if you aren't working to proactively deal with that risk, you're going to fumble when you do get compromised. Target, there's mixed reports on whether or not Target was a targeted attack or an opportunistic attack. The side that believes it was opportunistic believes it was just someone at that HVAC company fell for one of the millions of emails that got sent out. The hackers got in, figured out what they had access to, and then probably sold the access to another organization that was more professional.
Right. So for people who may not know this whole story, the Target breach, I think it was Christmas 2013. Is it that long ago now? But, made the news. I'm sure you remember it. The way that the Target system was compromised is that someone gained access to one of their vendors, an HVAC company, and then used that access to get access to Target's networks. So, Charles, you were just saying that some people, and I've always heard it described as an opportunistic attack, that they were sending out lots of phishing emails, and then they realized that they had access to Target through this other vendor, and then they took advantage of it. But you're saying maybe it was targeted. Tell us more.
There's one report I've read that suggested it was more targeted, that they did some research to figure out how to get into Target. I'm on the side that believes it was opportunistic, however.
So the idea here would be that they're just blasting these phishing emails out all over the place and seeing what they got. And in this case, they said, oh, goodness, we've got a really big fish here.
Absolutely.
And that is a great example of how your vendors, and in the case of healthcare, your business associates could potentially be a vector for this sort of thing if you don't have proper controls in place.
Absolutely. It really emphasizes the need to have solid vendor management processes and procedures. If you don't know what vendors need access at all times, how can you audit your environment to see who has access and what access is appropriate?
That's great. That's a great point. Because they pretty much got total access to the network once they got inside of Target.
Yeah, that was a calamity itself. They weren't alone. As we saw the rest of the following year, everybody had credit card information compromised.
Yeah, that's true. More and more. So shouldn't organizations already be protected?
So the should is twofold. Yes, everybody should, but security is hard, expensive, could be disruptive to business process. And the point of a business is to attract and retain customers and clients. And if you're impacting their user experience or your ability to support them, you lose that ability. So meshing good security controls with the least impactful controls is difficult. Organizations need to manage their organization. They need to refocus their priorities and find out what information is really important. Is protecting the information really important? I'm on the side that I say yes, but obviously balance with business. You have to identify what information is supremely important and put the controls around it. If you don't know where that data is, you can't possibly protect it or audit it to identify when and if it has been compromised, or in an investigation, figure out how.
So in the case of Target, again, I think it's an instructive example. They believed that they were protected. They had spent all of this money on security, and they even had an independent command center for security, and yet that proved to be illusory. Their protection wasn't nearly as good as they thought it was. Could you say more as an example?
Yeah, I believe I know they had a PCI compliance certification as well, and PCI is a very solid security standard. PCI has modified some things, for credit card compliance. They've modified some of the standard in response to how Target was breached and how everyone else was breached that year. So some of this can fall on that PCI assessor. Did they do a thorough job? How did they miss this? Was this included in the scope? Where does that fault lie? So you're right. To some extent, Target was doing a lot of good things, and they still fell. They've recovered pretty well, but
what I read was that they had part of it was alert fatigue. That they got alerts for everything, And they got
Yep.
so many alerts, they got into the habit of just dismissing all the alerts, which obviously then defeats the purpose of even having alerts.
Yep. And that's sort of on the side of once you set up the mechanisms and technology to create those alerts, you need to continue to tune those alerts to filter out the noise. There's a lot of noise in security logs, and a lot of it is meaningless. Some log management and analysis tools today can help you correlate and help you identify this event is important when we see these other two, but if we don't see those other two, this event isn't important. And that maturity is something relatively new.
That's interesting. So let's talk about money here. What are the factors that increase or decrease the cost of a breach? What's at stake here?
Yeah, so largely, obviously, depends a lot on the industry, the compliant fines that you could face, the type and amount of data. Depending upon how you're compromised, ransomware is a great example. If it compromises and encrypts your data, you've got a direct cost to recover it if you need to purchase the ransom. I always advise don't pay the ransom, it feeds the beast. That advice is a lot easier to say than to live by. And the FBI is on the side of keep your business running. If you need to pay the ransom, pay your ransom. Those have typically been relatively small. So it's an expensive security lesson to do better with backups and malware prevention. But it's not the ransoms haven't been a dollar amount by and large that's going to break the business. So different factors will affect the costs quite a bit. Where I was going with that ransomware tangent a little bit, there are some ransomwares out there that'll modify the cost or the ransom based on the type and number of files that it encrypts. So depending upon the types of data available to it, you'll see a different ransom charge.
That's impressive that it's that sophisticated. Impressive in a bad way.
Yeah, impressive in a bad way, certainly. They've got full-featured customer support forums because they want you to be able to recover your files.
Oh my goodness! So they're teaching you how to use Bitcoin so you can send them the money. I mean,
they certainly do. They want to have a reputation that you're going to get your files back if you pay your ransom. If they get the reputation that don't bother paying ransom, you don't get your files back anyway, no one will pay. And then that whole business model crumbles.
What a strange world we're living in. So go on.
It is indeed. With ransomware, I'd also add, if you get hit by it, always, always, always talk to some IT security professional before you consider paying the ransom or before you do anything. There are three ways that ransomwares have sort of been developed. One, they either did the encryption and decryption process correct, meaning you don't get that data back unless you pay the ransom or unless you have some other method to recover the data. Second way, they did the encryption, the decryption correctly, but not the encryption, which means they made a mistake that has allowed security researchers to figure out what the encryption key was and get your data back for free. The other side of it, they did the encrypting right, but they're unable to decrypt it. So even if you pay the ransom, you can't get the data back. And that's well-known information in the security industry, figuring out what ransomware you got and whether or not ransom will even work or if there's a free option.
That's interesting. So then also, presumably a security specialist would also know something about, at least potentially, the reputation of the group doing it.
Yeah, largely there are so many different ransomwares out there that I don't know that any time is spent on attributing any of them to specific groups. It's just, here's another ransomware campaign.
So I've never really heard of different levels of data breaches, except I guess in the HIPAA context, but tell us more about what that means.
Yeah, largely it's in the HIPAA world that I'm exposed to it. HIPAA 500 patients. If it's under 500, there are different reporting requirements than if it's over 500. In any case, it has to get reported to the secretary. They will likely do an investigation to figure out why that happened and if you were HIPAA compliant or not. All of the other organizations, all of the other compliance requirements, all of the other industries have their own compliance requirements and may have different levels. For any company in any of those industries, understanding those levels can help evaluate what levels of security to apply to the data. If it's a small file, maybe it gets treated with less concern. If it's a large database containing 140 million social security numbers, maybe we treat that a little more sensitively.
Well, it's remarkable how significant that 500 patient record level is in the healthcare universe because, like you're saying, a whole different set of requirements comes in. And not only do you have to inform HHS within, I believe it's 60 days, you also have to release a press release about the breach, which is obviously not something any company wants to do. And it's just a very much more what's the word I'm looking for? It's a more serious threat to the company, far more serious if it's 500 records or more than it would be if it were a smaller breach.
Yeah, it's absolutely a larger impact to their reputation because it becomes so public.
Right, exactly. It becomes public, and of course, if it's 500 records or more, you go up on what everybody calls the wall of shame up on the government website there. So there are quite a few companies on there, and I'm sure they would rather not be on that page.
Very true.
So I hear so many different numbers in this realm. What are the average direct costs associated with the data breach?
Yeah, that's the fun thing about this kind of a report or estimate. There are a number of different institutes that do their own surveys, and the data they collect and the way they analyze it always comes out with different numbers. So I'll always cite it. This comes from Ponemon study, sponsored by IBM. They calculated the average cost in the United States was around $225 per record. The fun thing about averages, if it costs one person $1,000 and 9 others $0, is the average cost 100? So if you're that one person that had the $1,000 fine, it's $1,000. For everyone else, it was nothing. So this $225 average could have some very high outliers in there. So figuring out where you fit in that is always something you have to figure out internally.
Yeah, it seems like kind of a funny way to do it because I've always read that costs for healthcare companies tend to be higher because the records are more valuable, the government fines don't apply to most other industries in the same way. Do you have any sense that generally, if you're in healthcare, you should, consider the fact that your data may be more valuable and more expensive if there's a breach?
Yeah, and a lot of this comes down to, this number is more for what's the cost to the organization, not how much each record is worth on the black market.
Sure.
This report did break apart healthcare and financial and public sector. And records, you could be expecting to have to pay $30,000 in all the recovery costs for it. In the public sector, I think it was like 120, 150. So significantly less, but still a substantial amount of money. And again, with this being an average, that could be just the average with some very high outliers in the data.
Right. You'd almost rather have a median here, but still valuable information. So what about that? You're talking about the direct costs in that last question. What about indirect costs?
Yeah, so those indirect costs, things damage to the reputation, needs to recover, potentially go out of business or offer discounts or all of those things to regain the trust of the customers whose data you were supposed to be protecting. That's a very difficult or different type of analysis to run, but accounting for both those direct and indirect costs can help you emphasize the importance of protecting the information appropriately on the front side. Especially when that indirect cost, it's really an estimate to the best of your guess. If there's some indirect cost you failed or didn't think to include, you're going to be paying a lot more in that indirect cost after a breach.
And this is where we would include things like reputational damage?
Absolutely.
Because I think that, especially in the healthcare industry, is so big. We're based in Chicago, and there have been some large breaches, and I'll spare naming the companies, but I remember the names of the companies. I'm sure many other people do who are involved in these breaches because they made big news in Chicago. I mean, they made national news, but in Chicago, because they were based there, there were lots of ongoing reports about it. And that is intangible, but it's certainly very damaging to those companies that when I think of that company, I also think of this large breach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Reputational damage is a big one. Potential fines, they're sort of direct, they're sort of indirect. The other one, potential increased insurance rates.
Oh, that's
if you had some cybersecurity insurance, or depending upon the type of the breach, that could impact your insurance costs or premiums.
One would think so. All right, so we've discussed sort of the environment now. Let's talk about what people can actually do to prepare for an incident. What if there is a breach?
Yep. So again, train your staff. Your staff is the weakest point, and I say your staff, but you also. Anyone on this listening to this webinar is human, and humans are fallible, loving to help people. So these phishing attacks that come through, we're all victims, we are all targets, we are all vulnerable to that avenue of attack. So train the staff, including every single executive. This can help prevent those phishing attacks from succeeding. It will not stop them, but it will help. After you've trained the staff, prepare for the eventual incident by having a solid response plan. Recently, there have been organizations that have had breaches and have really fumbled on the response plan. And they've taken a lot more flack and a lot more heat because of their poor response to the incident. Not because they were breached, but because of how they handled the breach. So have that response plan figured out and practiced for when there is a breach.
And that response plan, you're not just talking about, I assume, not just talking about sort of the technical things you need to do, but how the organization as a whole responds.
Organization as a whole, absolutely. Public relations, how you communicate it to the public, how you handle the customers whose data was breached. There's all sides of that. There's obviously the incident response technical side, and that's the part that is easiest for businesses to think that it's just a technical problem. And security is not a technical problem. That is a business problem. That's something that businesses need to address in all avenues. Policies and procedures are not technical controls. We can't put technical controls around everything a human can do. We do put technical controls in the forms of web content filters and password policies in the domain controllers and things like that. But we can't prevent them from sending email. We can't prevent them from conducting business processes in the wrong way. And these can all affect the security of the organization.
And I think it's on that PR front where many organizations have kind of flubbed their incident response because they weren't prepared to address it publicly in a way that would be maximally beneficial to the company. Instead, they were sort of improvising on the spot. At least that's what it looks like, because some of those initial responses from companies have been, as you said, pretty harshly criticized for being inadequate. And it seems clear that they weren't really ready to address something like this.
Yep, absolutely. You could say some of them have been impressive. It's certainly left an impression.
Yeah.
Part of what you can do to prepare for an incident is figure out what questions you would want to be able to answer if an incident happened. Maybe, how did they get in? What did they access once they were in? Did they change anything when they were in? Did they create any backdoor accounts? Did they change any passwords, export any password databases? Once you know the types and lists of questions you want to be able to answer, enable the appropriate logging to provide the answers. Many times when I've worked with organizations, they ask the questions for which the logs were never created. So they only started figuring out what questions they wanted to ask after the incident. And by that point, the log data is gone. It was never recorded, and it's not possible to get back. So figure out what questions you want to be able to answer and create the logging to be able to answer them.
That's great advice. Well, before I go on, we have a question from the audience, which I am going to hold because we'll be through our
Sure.
presentation before too long. But I just want to remind everybody out there that if you have questions for our expert, go ahead and type those into the chat area, because this is a unique opportunity to really get some expert advice. So don't hesitate to ask those questions. So continuing along the theme of our last one, what can folks do to prevent a breach from even happening? What can they do to protect themselves?
Yeah, so when you talk about preventing, if you want to actually prevent the breach, you have to treat your company like Fort Knox. Don't allow access in or out without fully understanding and accounting for the risks that that access provides. That means disabling remote access and internet browsing, disabling any portable media. Once you figure out where your data is and that you've ultimately protected it, now it's much harder for anyone, good or bad, to access. Having employees have a difficult time to access the data is not good for business, obviously. But you can create secure methods for valid access. Figuring out what access people will need and to what data allows you to single sort of access by access create that access or enable that access in a secure fashion. Everybody talks about BYOD and what that's doing to business, but it's really being enabled by default. And we're only now coming back around and saying, well, now what about security? We've let that data out of the organization, and now we have to try to claim it back. People say the perimeter is gone. I'd argue we just need to take it back. Having the controls around the data and having the responsibility for identifying how that data is accessed is something we can do. We just need to work for it.
So when you're saying BYOD, that's bring your own device, and usually we're talking about phones in that sense, and that many companies and many practices, I'm sure, in an effort, I suppose, to make life convenient, allow people to bring their phones in and access what are supposed to be secure networks with their phones, which then just, I mean, that's a security nightmare. Is that safe to say that that is a very bad way of going about things?
By allowing it by default without figuring out the security controls that should be enabled is, in my mind, backwards. And I'm not criticizing any company.
Sure.
We're all sort of taken off guard on the whole ability to carry computers around in your pocket.
Yeah, people just kind of sleptwalk into this without really thinking about the security implications, it seems like, at first.
Yep. And we don't need to go the route of disable all these remote accesses, but we can go the route of identify the remote access that is needed, start to control it, and once we've got a handle on that, start going through disabling everything else that isn't controlled and doesn't want to be.
All right. Is this, and this is something that always comes up around risk analysis and all that stuff, is this something that people can do in-house, or is it better to use a partner?
So consultants, outside consultants, can get you up to speed much more quickly. They've got the expertise and experience to know what should be managed and how should we manage it. They would likely be more expensive. So depending upon the costs associated with a consultant for your organization, which will vary by size, you need to make the decision of how quickly you want to get things secured and locked down. A partner can get you secured rather quickly, but you'll pay for it. Hiring someone to do it internally or having someone internal do it could be slower, especially if it's a current employee or partner, as their workload is probably already full. Hiring a new employee obviously costs money, and then they have to get some experience with the organization and how they're structured prior to being able to effectively and minimally impactfully locking items down, locking access down. So hiring a partner is a good way to go. to get up to speed and ramp up quickly. Long term, it's going to require dedicating an employee to security, whether that's a new employee or shifting responsibilities for a current employee. That'll obviously vary.
So you're saying even if you bring in a partner, they can sort of, I don't know how to put it, but they can get you where you need to be for the moment, but then you're still going to need to have this ongoing commitment to security.
Yep, you have to have someone, and this sort of falls under vendor management. If you hire a consultant to come in and do all of this work, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think it's not cost effective to have a consultant like that 365 days a year. So it's probably cost effective to hire an individual to do it dedicated. At the very least, someone in the organization needs to be managing the vendors, including this consultant.
So when you say it's likely to result in a higher quality end product if you hire a professional firm, the reason for that is that they have greater expertise, I assume?
Largely focused on their experience, their certifications, their education and training.
Okay.
Nothing that is insurmountable for a new hire or an internal person. The outside organization, the consultant, the partner, just has the experience to draw on.
All right. Well, let's take some of our questions then. If you've been holding your question, now is the time to ask. We've got a couple in. So let's begin. This question is, we are a therapy clinic and our EMR vendor sends appointment reminders via text as well as email. Are texts subject to the same security breaches and ransomware attacks? What questions should I ask our EMR company to learn the security measures they have in place to protect our health records? Thank you for the question.
Yeah, so text and email for appointment reminders. From my understanding in HIPAA, you have to get the patient's consent for that form of communication. If the EMR is allowing it, I'm assuming that the EMR is also aware of that HIPAA requirement. There's little concern over any ransomware associated with that, as that's just email, that's just a text. If it gets encrypted, you could send it again. If the EMR gets encrypted, that's a different story. So I think primarily there you need to address the HIPAA privacy concerns over sending what is PHI over an unencrypted message, text message or email. And I think largely that's addressed by having the patient sign that consent form.
We might note as well that texts are generally not considered very secure because they are not encrypted and you can't, they're easy to monitor, and you can't delete them in the sense that you can delete them off of a phone or something, but you can't delete them out of the carrier. So there are, whatever you're sending by text is probably should not be considered secure. Is that safe to say, Charles?
Absolutely. Text and email are not secure. There is encrypted email that can make email secure. Secure email, encrypted email is not very functional, largely because email was invented 40 years ago now, prior to security being a concern. So all encrypted emails that I've dealt with have been sort of add-ons to make email encrypted. And those add-ons don't integrate as well because email never intended for it.
Right, and so I think it can be hard to get folks to use those emails because, and I see this sometimes with practices. So, we train a lot of medical professionals, and some practices have, heard the security sermon, and then they turn on end-to-end encryption for all emails. Which winds up being a big hassle because, like, if they're sending me an email that just says, "Hey, I forgot my password," there's no PHI in our system. There's no real security concern around whether or not someone has finished HIPAA training, and so there's no reason for that email to be secure. And yet, I will then go in and have to log into a portal or something to see that email, which is fine. I'm not complaining, but I'm saying if I were a patient and I were getting something that was just doesn't need to be secure and I had to do that, I wonder how many patients would actually go through all those steps needed to access that secure email. And my guess is that many of them would just give up.
Yeah, it's definitely not very user-friendly, that's
Right,
for sure.
right.
Yep. On the point of email, I've had some people ask me about email preventing or email encryption preventing things like W-2 emails, where they ask for all the W-2s in the organization. And email encryption will make it so that those W-2s are encrypted on the way to the hacker, that the
Right, even the
hacker will
hacker.
receive it because that's who you sent it to.
Right. So you're protecting the information from everyone except the person you want to protect it from, which is the hacker who will be able to access it.
Yep,
Well, that's a shame.
absolutely.
Well, keep your questions coming in. This question is about whitelisting. Should practices use whitelisting in their networks?
I am a huge fan of whitelisting.
Can you explain what
Whitelisting,
it is?
yeah. So whitelisting started way back when we started connecting computers together and calling it the internet. We never had firewalls initially because we trusted everyone in that network because there were all but 10 people or whatever. As that grew, people started to see random packets coming through, random information coming across the network that was causing issues. So people started putting firewalls in place that blocked the malicious or corrupted information. Now it's a standard practice to whitelist in the firewall, which means the firewall blocks everything except what we add to a whitelist, a list of approved communication. Antivirus is a blacklisting technology. It maintains a list of all the bad stuff and assumes everything else is good. Application whitelisting is the opposite of that. Assume everything is bad and block it unless it's in a short whitelist. I'm a fan of, this is, I think, inevitable, but internet resource whitelisting as well, where you're not allowed to talk to anything on the network, anything on the internet, unless it specifically has been added to a whitelist. That can cause a lot of trouble for personal lives, but it should not cause any trouble for a business. Businesses shouldn't be talking to random websites very often. People do all the time when they're browsing for the latest deal on some airplane ticket or a nifty coffee mug for Christmas.
But we don't want to be using our secure network to do that sort of thing. And I guess that, uh, brings up another larger issue, which is it seems to me that some organizations need to rethink their attitude toward what is supposed to be a secure network. That it, I think people maybe because, and this is related to the BYOD thing in a way too, that people have really learned about the internet, I think, largely as consumers, as just private individuals who are goofing around doing what we all do every day. And so then they have a different set of expectations about what a secure network should be like. I wonder if you could address that.
Yeah, so we've certainly mixed business and personal use in the network. If you think prior to the internet, people would go to work and work on the computers, and the only thing they could do on the computer was the business applications. Some businesses still included Minesweeper and Solitaire, and I'm sure employees were goofing off playing those things. So not that goofing off or time wasting has been a new thing since the age of the internet. That's been here, I think, forever. The new thing that the internet is sort of opened is a door to malicious use. You weren't going to get a virus by playing solitaire. You can get a virus by just browsing the internet or reading your personal email on a corporate machine. Mixing those two uses is, for one thing, not a business need, and it opens up risk that the business doesn't need to address. If you close that access, you impact the way in which people loaf around at their desk, but you don't impact the business process. And to those that are ultimately concerned about, well, we want to be an employer of choice, to that I would say, give every employee twice the amount of break time, but say they have to go to the break room to browse the internet. They're probably spending that much time at their desk browsing the internet anyway, so you're probably not saving or losing any productivity. Then configure the break room with as many computers as you want, connected to a different network, not a business organization network.
Okay, I'm
Open
glad
up
you said
access
that
to the
because
internet.
I wanted to ask about that, and you anticipated the question. So one way of dealing with this is then to have a segregated network that isn't connected to the secure network in any way. Is that what you're
Yep,
saying?
yep. Two different networks, a guest network and a corporate network. Corporate network can only access network resources, internet resources that are required for the business. That'll block most of the hacker communication. That will block most of the websites on which hackers host their malware. Now, the break room might get flooded with malware, and there are computers out there that you can schedule every night to revert to yesterday's configuration. So even if they do get compromised during one day, tomorrow they're all going to revert to the state that we know is good.
Right, because these computers don't have, by design, they don't have valuable information that they're storing. And so if they get wiped every night, then that's all to the good because they don't have anything valuable on them anyway.
Right? You also care less if they get stolen.
That's a good point, too. Well, I wonder if you could address then what folks should do about BYOD. If phones are an important part of the business, are we kind of going back to the future where the company should issue phones, or what would be your advice on that?
So largely, I'm okay with email and calendar and contacts on the phones. PHI and other super secret corporate secrets shouldn't be in those things. And managing what devices are allowed to connect to that mail service, your mail and contacts, can limit that risk as well. Largely require that the devices are patched. That requires that requires almost exclusively current iPhones and Google Pixels.
What does that
Microsoft,
mean that they be patched?
that they have the latest security patches from the vendor. Google Pixels and iPhones have an incredible track record at providing patches to the end users. The other Android carriers do not.
And so
The
the
older
problem here
phones
you're
on
saying
all
is
of them
like,
do not.
if I'm sorry to interrupt, Charles, but so if I'm on
That's right.
Verizon or something, and I'm just picking a random carrier, I'm not saying anything bad about Verizon, but if I'm on some private carrier like that, when it comes to Android, they roll out their own versions of the Android updates, and it's often much, much later than when Google issues them. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the supply chain and patches, we can talk about Google Pixel, all other Android phones, and iPhones. iPhones and Google Pixel are identical. Google releases a patch, Google Pixel phones get it. Apple releases a patch, Apple phones get it. Picking random carriers, Google releases a patch, Samsung has to modify it for their hardware. Then they provide it to the carriers, HTC or Verizon and Sprint and AT&T. They have to again modify it for their network, and then it gets handed out to the end users. Those two middle companies have no financial incentive to modify and take the time to modify the Android operating system. So that creates a large problem and a delay in getting those patches to the end users. Getting those patches closes the holes on which hackers depend to compromise our systems.
And it does seem like I don't know if this is true, but I have the perception at least that there is increasing interest in compromising phones from the malware community, if there is such a thing.
Absolutely. Consider the sources of data that a phone provides that a computer, by and large, doesn't. They've got a microphone, a camera, a GPS, tons of data, passwords, wireless network access. They have far more data and access on a phone than they do on a computer in the office. That computer in the office may not even have a microphone, may not even have a camera. And now they can get that information. It's never traveling, so they don't know where you are as a result of having the malware on the phone. So everyone, in my opinion, should be focusing on these phones that have a good track record of applying patches. Ideally, and this is where, in my opinion, Apple shines better than Google, having application whitelisting. Apps that have not gone through an Apple review of the source code can't run on iPhones. Google doesn't have that application whitelisting available yet, at least not that I've heard of. And if anybody knows, please let me know. I'd love to read about it.
Interesting. So this question is about training. Can you tell us more? When it comes to preventing breaches, it sounds like training is a big part of the equation. Can you tell us more about what that training should entail?
Yeah, so consider the two types of breaches that training can address, the accidental or malicious. So accidental is largely handle PHI this way, don't email it out, don't do this and that. Here's how we comply with HIPAA privacy laws or other industry privacy requirements. Training is obvious there, and we've been doing that for a long time. The other accidental or malicious comes in how we help hackers get into the organizations by clicking on these links, by not using good passwords, by using the same password that's included in every other website that we happen to go to. When I started using a password manager, I had no idea how many accounts I had out there. And I, like many people, used the same password for everything. As I would go to the websites and enter that same password, that would be my reminder to update it. And I'd go through the change password, add to password manager, and move on. And now I've got like 200 different websites that I've got an account on. And I never would have guessed that I had 200 accounts floating out there, likely all of them with the same old password.
Tell us more.
I was trusting, yeah,
I'm
last
sorry.
thing on that,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was trusting the security of my bank account with the security of the lowest denominator. Some random little, maybe it was a coupon printing or a weather website.
Right.
Something that probably isn't as incented to take security so seriously.
I'll bet there are a lot of people out in the audience right now, maybe a little red-faced, because I think so many of us do this because, of course, it's hard to remember a password. And if you make a nice kind of complicated password, then it's even harder to remember. And so if you just use this password anywhere, all someone has to do is steal it from one place. Like, as you said, it might not even be a very secure website or whatever to begin with. So it might be easy to steal. They steal it, and then they have your password to everything.
Yep. And that's a common way for criminals to get into things. I watched a live tweeted event where some password database was breached, and I was watching hackers tweet about how they found and got into a PayPal account. I got into this and that account. To me, that's insane because they were admitting their public criminal activity on Twitter.
Right.
But they must be confident in their security operations, so they aren't going to get found, apparently.
Well, and it does seem that sometimes hackers can't help but brag a little bit.
Yep.
But you mentioned a password manager. Just quickly for folks who may not know, how does that work?
So the password manager is a program that sits on your computer or your phone. It can be synchronized across your devices. It maintains a list of all the websites you go to. It can contain other secure notes, credit cards. It doesn't have to be just website credentials. And it manages what your username and password is for each website. It can also generate to suggest very, very strong passwords as well. My Papa John's password is 30-some characters. I have no idea what it is.
That's incredible.
And that's just to protect ordering pizza. But I said it that way because I could, and honestly, it was harder to choose some random password than to just let the password manager generate a really good one.
Now, so that's obviously valuable. Now, I notice these days that, for example, Google Chrome, for example, will sort of act like a password manager. Like it will ask you if you want to save passwords. Is that something that is secure, or how does that technology work? Is that dangerous?
So 2 points on that, maybe 3 as I talk. Historically, different web browsers did not protect that password vault very well. They have gotten better, and they now use your Windows domain credentials to encrypt the database, so it's encrypted as well as your domain password is. The other side of it, I much rather give my money to a company whose only business is in creating a password vault. Google and every other web browser, they give the browser away for free. So it begs the question, where's their revenue model? And is password management a high priority for them? Studies have been done on the strength of password management vaults. One was done by Elcomsoft. They're a good password recovery software. And the password managers out there, some of them restricted password guessing of the vault down to 3,000 or 6,000 guesses per second, which may seem fast, but compared to others, they allowed 129,000 per second. And it's a numbers game at that point. How quickly can they find your password?
Right, because they're using computers to brute force their way in. Is that correct?
Right.
They're just guessing passwords, thousands and thousands per second.
Yep, and eventually they'll find it. The eventually might be the end of the age of the universe, but hopefully.
Well, if you've got a
good password,
then everyone will be dead by the time they find it, and you'll be fine. Well, Charles, we're almost out of time. I want to thank you for joining us today, because this has been great information, not only on the corporate side, but you've also given us valuable consumer information. I was wondering if you could take a little bit of time in the few minutes we have left to tell us what you folks over at Netgain do.
So any mature security operation will not depend on any single layer of defense. There isn't a single layer that's 100%. If there were, everyone would do it and the problem would be solved. So there are many layers of defense in there. Spam filterings are one of the first and easiest to implement. They cut out a lot of stuff. Firewalls, staff training, this is all off the top of my head, so I'll probably forget a few. Antivirus is still in there. It's more on the bottom of the list. It's a almost last line of defense. Application whitelisting is standard. I know of a few methods around application whitelisting. In response to that, we've got another software that protects those methods. We've seen some of those methods used, and that other technology comes in and blocks things. I do know of a couple of ways around that. I haven't seen any attacks use those avenues yet, but we're looking at ways to block those attacks as well.
So security is really your business over there at Netgain. Is that safe to say?
I'm the chief worrier. I worry about how they can get in and try to figure out how to stop them. So people get a little surprised when I tell them my job is not to keep the hackers out. My job is to make it tough. So I accept that I cannot keep someone out that wants desperately to get in. So I spend my day figuring out how they could get in and making it harder for them to get in. And then finally, offsite backups in case they get in and destroy data, we can rebuild somewhere else.
And so you all provide cloud-based hosting essentially for folks. Is that safe to say, or is that a fair?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you could say cloud-based hosting. It's a hosted desktop. You could say in the cloud.
So for people who are looking for more information about how to, whether it's to secure your own network or to look at the possibilities that Netgain offers, and we've talked about some of these other services like disaster recovery and other learning lunches. So I would definitely encourage everyone to head on over to netgaincloud.com, if I can pronounce it. Go on over to Netgain, because they've got a lot of really great services for offer that you should look into if you're in the market for improving your security. That's one of the things that they are very good at. And that is why we are always glad to have Charles Kilmer join us, because he is truly an expert on these issues and gives us his unvarnished advice on what to do. And we always enjoy having you, Charles. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Anytime, always happy.
I always learn something, and I'm sure that our audience does as well. So thank you again. Do check out Netgain and go to our website at formatapproved.com to see about upcoming learning lunches, or if you're interested in training. Thank you for joining us today. Remember that you'll get an email after this event with the slides and the video recording. So look in your email inbox for that follow-up email, and thank you for joining us today.